Hi, I'm Margaret Webb with Daily Extra, and we are thrilled to have Sarah Waters on our show today. Sarah blasted onto the literary scene in 1998 with Tipping the Velvet, which is slang for, you say it.
Can I say?
Yeah, you say it.
Cunnilingus.
Cunnilingus. And it was about an oyster girl turned music hall performer turned rent boy. 6 novels and 1 million copies later. Is that what the latest count is? She arrives at the International Festival of Authors here in Toronto with her latest novel, The Paying Guest. And it has all the hallmarks of a Sarah Waters novel. It's a historical fiction. It's a lesbian picaresque. It's a feminist Dickens, as some of the critics have called it. And I will add my 2 cents and say it has broad appeal, which the pun is intended and both not intended. Critics have talked to you, explained your incredible success by saying that you're one of the best storytellers of our time. And I'm curious to know what attracted you to this particular story of The Paying Guest?
Well, it's set in 1922 in London, and which I realised once I began my research, it was just a sort of really fascinating time. You know, people coming out of the war, feeling exhausted. It was an unhappy time with lots of tensions around returning servicemen, were kind of disgruntled. There were tensions between men and women, between the classes, between the generations. But it was also a time that was beginning to move forward and become very modern in a way that we would understand the term. So there was a lot going on. The Paying Guest was kind of inspired by a real-life murder story, the Ilford murder of 1922. It's not in any sense a retelling of that story, but it was a kind of classic murder story. A wife, unhappily married, a husband and a male lover. The male lover killed the husband, but the wife, Edith Thompson, was put on trial for incitement and was hanged. Yeah, it was kind of a tragic, extraordinary case. But that triangle really fascinated me, and of course it's a very heterosexual triangle. But I began to think, well, what would happen if the lover was a female? What would that do to this sort of traditional murder story? And immediately, you know, the story began to come alive for me, and that became The Paying Guest.
I find it very concerned with typical, I guess, British concerns of class, but also the intersection with gender. It seems to me that there's an attempt constantly in the novel to render the invisible visible. Like, for instance, Frances is invisible as a higher class woman, but she has no money left. So she's not, her poverty is invisible in some ways. She's invisible as a lesbian. And when the 2 lovers get together, their path seems invisible. I'm wondering
yes. No, I mean, that was one of the things that really interested me about this. That, you know, in the first half of the novel, I mean, it's not giving too much away to say that, you know, Frances, the main character in the book, and Lillian, who's the lodger who moves in, the married woman, they have an affair. And it's exciting, it's wonderful, but it's limited by the fact that Lillian is still married. Frances wants to move forward, and as you say, it's protected because it's invisible, even while that's frustrating for Frances. There's this central dramatic incident after which the invisibility becomes, you know, has a slightly different charge to it. They become protected in a different kind of way. They become kind of vulnerable, actually, to being discovered as lesbians with all that entails, given that the twist the story has taken. So, yeah, issues about who could see what became very important to me as I was writing this novel. They're really at the heart of the book. Most of the action takes place in a house, a suburban house. You have Frances and her mother, her elderly mother, Lillian and Leonard, all living together. So there's it's very much a question of, you know, who can hear what on the other side of the wall, who can glimpse what through the crack of the door, you know, which, as I say, is exciting in the first half of the book, but in the second half becomes very, very dangerous for Frances and Lillian.
And one of the ways that you render this lesbian relationship visible is with some pretty hot sex scenes. And I just have to read a line here. She seemed to have lost a layer of skin, to be kissing not simply with her lips, but her nerves, her muscle, her blood. But your sex scenes, while they're very hot and beautifully written, they're very funny too. I mean, there's often a humorous undercut, like, for instance, Lillian will say, well, with the movement of her hand, as if women made sapphic gestures to her every day. Tell me about that. Is there, that's a particular quality of your writing, is there something inherently lesbian about sex and humor.
I think sex and intimacy often has a comic element to it, you know. That's exactly what we don't tend to see when we see sex represented on screen, say, on TV or in films, where it tends to be seamless, perfect, you know, everything happens in the right order at the right time. And, you know, sex is sometimes like that, but on the whole, in real life, sex is much more untidy than that. And there are those moments when you begin to realise that you've got cramp, or, you know, you're in an odd position. And those are what makes sex interesting. So, yeah, I've tried to do justice to the untidiness of sex in the books, as well as hopefully keeping it exciting.
It seems like, and I'm not sure about this, but is there a little bit of an homage to lesbian literature in Britain with this book? You mentioned Bloomsbury and the humorous scenes, the Alice B. Tolkien. I don't know if there's a...
Well, I certainly read a lot of, I always read a lot of fiction from a period that I'm writing about. That's a very good way for me of getting into the mind of a period. And because often my stories are lesbian stories, you know, I'll be very mindful of the sort of lesbian literature that's around in a period. So as background to this book, I did read, say, the letters between Virginia Woolf and Beta Sackville-West, which are wonderfully flirty and playful, very exciting. There's some novels from the period that feature lesbian characters, not always in rather positive ways, but they're still very interesting. Things like Regiment of Women by Clemence Dane. There's a book called The Tortoiseshell Cat by Naomi Royd-Smith from the post-war period, I think, which has a sort of bohemian lesbian character called VV, who paints her room with sort of violet walls and black skirting boards and things like that. So there you get these glimpses of lesbian life through the fiction of the period. Radcliffe Hall, of course, Well of Loneliness would come out 1928. But even before that, she had lesbian characters in some of her novels and stories. And there does tend to be a kind of somberness to some of those depictions of lesbian life. So in this novel, I did want to kind of write back to those by, you know, telling a lesbian story that was more upbeat. I mean, God, Frances and Lillian have a hard time in this book, but nevertheless, their love is the core of the story.
There's no shame. Neither of the characters feel any shame in their love.
No,
they feel frustrated that there's not a narrative path to move forward in it, or that people won't recognize it. I mean, it was a brilliant scene when, well, maybe I'm giving away too much. I'm not going to talk about that brilliant scene. You have to read the novel. I talked to my friends about what they loved about your work, because you have really amazing fans that just, they will say, I just love your work. And they said, you don't give up the finely wrought sentence for the plot, and you don't give up the plot for the finely wrought sentence.
That's really nice to hear.
And I'm wondering, where does story start for you? How do you put together a story? Because you write doorstoppers. I mean, 6 novels in how many years that are...
There's a lot of words.
There's a lot of words in your books. How do you even start to put together a story?
Well, the story for me is always at the heart of a book, and I'm always happiest when I have my story quite well worked out in advance. It gives a kind of skeleton to the book. And then what...
So you do an outline?
I do all that kind of thing. Sometimes, I mean, with the last book, The Little Stranger, I even had practically the very last scene, you know, in my head the whole time I was writing. I was just working towards it. What changes, though, what emerges for me is characters, characterization, how the characters feel about the things I need them to do, how they feel about each other, how they feel about themselves, and that takes some figuring out, like kind of getting to know the characters, really, or at least getting to know how they should be for the purposes of this story. And yeah, that's one of the excitements of writing. I mean, Frances came to me quite earlier. She's this sort of spirited but kind of frustrated young spinster in the language of the time, you know, an unmarried woman still living at home. She's had an exciting life in the past, but she's put it aside. Lillian took a bit longer to come to life for me. You know, she's married. There's something a bit opaque about her life with her husband. I liked that. Frances can never quite enter into their marriage. That seemed important to me, and adds to the tension later on when Frances gets a bit paranoid. So yeah, just sort of bit by bit, trying out scenes. I'll get a sense of what my characters should be saying to each other.
You mentioned in one interview you did, I think it was with Out Magazine, that you had a crisis of confidence writing this book. I did. So what was that about?
It was a hard book to write, this was. They've all had completely different challenges. You'd think book 6, you'd think it'd be getting easier, wouldn't you? But I think each book is different. The last book was very straightforward. Whereas with this book, I did have, once I got my story worked out, that was great. But it's a, you know, that aside, it's a very character-led novel. I really wanted my readers to be interested in my characters and their dilemmas. And rather like The Night Watch, which was my novel set in the Second World War, that again was a very character-led book. And it just, for me, takes a lot of figuring out. I mean, it took more than 4 years to write, and for the first couple of years, I hadn't found the tone that I was happy with, so I did lots of rewriting, and yeah, I did lose heart a bit, kind of halfway through.
And somewhat relieved to hear that it took you 4 years as opposed to 500 words in a year. Thank you for being human. That was great. Historical fiction. All your stories are so rooted in time and place. You know, you mentioned you studied well, tell me about your PhD.
Yeah, I mean, I started writing fiction after I'd done some academic work. I did a PhD thesis which looked at lesbian and gay historical fiction from the sort of late Victorian period onwards, by which I mean the ways in which lesbian and gay people, to use a very modern, you know, term, or people writing about homosexuality have often appealed to the past. You know, gay men in the 19th century would talk about Greek love as this kind of, you know, model of noble gay life. Women have often talked about Sappho. They've appealed to Sappho in a similar kind of way. So I've always been interested since then in how we write about the gay past, how we imagine it, how it continually changes as our ideas about homosexuality have changed. And that led, yeah, straight into me writing fiction with Tipping the Velvet.
Is there something that you can say in historical fiction that may be less easy to say or in modern?
Well, I think that has been true in the past, and that was one of the big things that I wrote about, really, was that often people have been able to be freer in the things they've been able to say about homosexuality by setting characters in the past. There's a British writer called Naomi Mitchison who was writing in the 20s and 30s, and she wrote, you know, lots of historical novels, but were quite interesting things sexually were going on, and she said, oh, apparently it's all right if they wear wolfskins and togas. She said, you know, you could get away with things if you put somebody in a Roman setting or whatever. So that has been true in the past. I mean, and that, for me, that's not the appeal of writing historical fiction, because hooray, we live in a time, you know, I live in a country in which I can write freely about lesbian life in a contemporary setting if I want to. I'm genuinely interested in the past for its own sake, really, in the way in which you don't have to go back very far before mores begin to look very different, cultural mores, sexual mores. And of course, from a narrative point of view, you go back, say, to the 20s, and you can write with confidence about lesbians with an identity, a community, friends, but it was nevertheless quite a dangerous time to be a lesbian, and so there's that narrative charge to the stories that's always kind of exciting to write about.
And there seems to be such a preoccupation with codes, how codes or how language makes things visible, makes lifestyles visible, and the characters seem to be constantly working out those codes, even just what to call each other. Yes,
that's true. I mean, you know, and we've always, I think lesbian and gay men, queer people have always been very good at making their own codes, because the society hasn't given them codes, hasn't given them positive vocabularies, it's probably given them rather negative words to use. So we've always been very good at making our own subcultures, making our own communities, making our own families, finding ways, very, very subtle ways, perhaps, you know, women wearing rings on their little fingers, ways of identifying each other and making contact with each other. And yeah, I mean, Frances has a friend, Christina, who's living with another woman. They would read certain kinds of books, you know, they'd have a certain commonality of interest that they'd be able to draw on. Lillian, of course, is married, she's straight, she's come from a very different background, so there's that little charge between her and Frances.
And doesn't even really understand what's going on initially, well, even though there's the attraction and the closeness and intimacy.
Yes, that's right.
We're getting to the serious part of the interview now, which is when I ask you, what's it like to be a famous lesbian author? What everybody really wants to know.
Well, you mentioned my fans earlier and said how wonderful they are. And actually, you know, they are, and they have been right from the very beginning. It's been brilliant for me. Tipping the Velvet, it took a while for Tipping the Velvet to become a mainstream success. It wasn't really till it got on TV in 2002. But in the 4 years you know, following its publication, it got a very committed lesbian readership, and that was really delightful.
But you also have a
I do.
over cross-dressing readership, both, you know, all puns intended. But a crossover readership, you have a very wide appeal.
Yeah, I do, and that's wonderful. I mean, every author wants to be read by as many different kinds of people as possible, but nevertheless, it's really important to me that I've retained, you know, that core lesbian readership, and that I'm very, you know, I know the last book that there wasn't any lesbian content, and that disappointed some of my readers. This novel, you know, has lots of lesbian stuff going on in it. So I've made up for it, haven't I? But it is, yeah, it's important to me that that I have those readers.
And you also have to deal with interviewers. Excuse me, after each of this, giving you presents.
Oh, I wasn't expecting that.
So you have to open that. See what you have to say about that.
What is this?
What is it with the radishes in the
So
paying
you like
guest?
radishes? They go on a picnic. Francis and Lillian go on a picnic to the park.
and Francis takes eggs and radishes?
They have this perfect meal when they get there. Lillian has taken jam tarts, little fancy sandwiches. Francis has taken hard-boiled eggs, cold tea, and some radishes, which are very, very British, you know.
Are they say British or symbolic of something? I'm not sure what.
They're very tart, aren't they? They're
Yes,
very, they've got a real bite to them, radishes. I like that idea. Francis has got that kind of, they're hot.
Yeah.
Great, they're beautiful, they're small but perfectly formed. Thank you so much.
I'll just leave you hold it. No, I do want to know, what is a day-to-day life for Sarah Waters? What does your life look like when you're not at the International Festival of Authors?
Well, it depends a lot on what stage of writing I'm at. So most of my life is very 9 to 5-y, Monday to Friday. That's how I write. It's my job. I mean, it's a wonderful job, but it's my job. And so I'll just be researching, or I'll be at my desk. I aim to write 1,000 words a day.
1,000 words a day.
It's about 2 pages. It's not much.
Okay.
But sometimes I'll achieve that very easily. Sometimes it's hard, but I'll just keep going. And so gradually build up a manuscript like that. But actually most of my writing is rewriting. And near the end of a book, it gets very intense, and it kind of overspills into the rest of my life. And then it's more like, I don't know, the image of a kind of mad writer. You know. It's very office-bound, study-bound. I'm in my study most of the time. Like,
but I hear you're a big walker, though. I hear
yeah, I live in London. I love walking in London. I like city walking. My characters tend to like city walking. Francis does. And that's a great compliment to writing. If I turn off my computer at 5 o'clock, say, go for a walk, and the book is still with me, or churning away in my head. Yeah, often it's when I leave my desk that I have some of the best ideas, actually.
You have a partner of 12 years, and you've
14
years, okay. And you've always described yourself as being middle-aged. Middle-aged always. I'm curious about that comment.
I think I was probably born middle-aged. I'm one of those people who's born middle-aged, and so very happy to actually be middle-aged now, because I can just be, you know, my true self.
You've grown into your middle-agedness.
Exactly.
Okay.
Oh, I don't know. You know what it's like being middle-aged. No, I mean, I didn't mean that personally. Obviously, you don't. You've got years to go yet.
No, seriously, I'm still 12.
But you know, it's about being kind of sedate, and also it's about having confidence, I think. And when you're younger, you worry that you're not being kind of cool enough or something like that. Kind of all falls away when you're middle-aged. It's great. You just do what on earth you like, and it's very nice. It's a good period of life to be in, I think.
It's awesome. What's next for you?
Well, I suppose I should start writing another book, shouldn't I? I've got a bit more travelling to do first. Yeah, but normally by this point I have quite a good idea about the next book, and I must say this time I don't. So I'm quite enjoying having a break, and I'm trying to be relaxed about it. I have some small ideas. I need to do some reading and some thinking, just see what happens. Just see what happens.
Well, I think if you hang out in Toronto for a few more days, you'll get lots of stories here.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Just one more note. Will we see Sarah Waters ever write a contemporary novel, or set in contemporary times? All your novels are very contemporary, but set in contemporary times. Are you going to stick with historical?
I don't know, actually. Probably for the next one, but there might well come a point when I would like to try a new setting, to try a contemporary setting, to see what happens really to my voice, to my writing. That might seem like a really good move to make. So we'll see.
Well, that'll be exciting. And I just really want to share this with readers. Sarah Waters, The Paying Guest, is a terrific novel. I really highly recommend it.
Thanks very
Thank
much.
you
And
so
thanks for
much.
these.
Oh yes, well
What a treat.
enjoy. Radishes. Thank you so much.
Thank you.